Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Sharing Our Stories. I do apologize to our Zoom audience and our library audience and our YouTube audience for the delay in our start. We were having, as you can imagine, some technology difficulties, but they're all straightened up now. So welcome to Sharing Our Stories. I'm Ann Crimmings, and I'm glad you could join us tonight. We have a very compelling session for you with our speaker, Julie Hart, and I'll introduce her in just a few moments. I'm going to begin with a couple of announcements. First, I'd like to thank Kay Lebowski and Hassan Chomert for all of their efforts over the last few months as we've moved SOS into a hybrid model, including this in-library component, which has been technologically challenging, as you have all witnessed here tonight. So I appreciate all of their expertise and time and patience. Let me quickly review the guidelines and procedures for tonight. We ask our Zoom audience to please turn off your video and your microphone so you can be able to see us and hear us, but the background noise for your Zoom audience will be reduced. Presentation will be about 45 minutes or so, followed by a question and answer period. On Zoom, please feel free to use chat, and you can submit those questions in writing anytime. When the presentation is over, I'll read those questions aloud and Julie will answer those. We'll also take, of course, questions from our in-person audience and questions from our Zoom audience. If anybody on Zoom would like to ask a question, just be sure to click on your mic. Finally, our next Sharing Our Stories will be April 25th, and the speaker will be Sam Shim, who emigrated to the US from South Korea as a child and went on to become the first Asian American to be elected in Columbus to public office. He served on the Worthington Board of Education for 8 years. So I'm sure you'll have a very interesting story to tell, and I hope that you'll join us. Now, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Julie Hart. Julie is a semi-retired person who seems very busy for someone who is semi-retired, professor from the sociology department at Ohio Dominican University, where she continues to teach courses in peace and justice and sociology on a part-time basis, including a travel and volunteer course in Guatemala for Ohio Dominican students who are interested in peace and justice. Julie earned a master's degree in peace studies and a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. She and her husband, Phil, have volunteered in Christian peacemakers in international areas of conflict, including Israel, Palestine, and Colombia in South America. Julie was a convert to the Mennonite faith as an adult and attends the Columbus Mennonite Church in Clintonville. She will speak to us tonight about the Mennonite faith and her personal faith journey. I've had the pleasure of knowing Julie for about 20 years now as a valued colleague at Ohio Dominican and as a good friend. And I am so pleased to welcome you, Julie, to Sharing Our Stories.
Wow, I'm very glad to be here. And I see in the audience here and on Zoom that there are some ethnic Mennonites, and I am not an ethnic Mennonite. I became a Mennonite about 35 years ago, but I grew up at First Community Church, which is in Arlington, which is a community church, and it served me well, but I was looking for something more. And in 1990, my husband and I joined the Mennonite Church, and I'll tell you more about how that came about. Oh, look at the camera more.
No, yeah.
No, you're good.
You're good now. You were a little bit off.
Turning this way. Okay, so I can't look at you all
No,
as
you can
much.
do wherever you need to. It's just you were off
Off
camera.
seven.
Now you're on.
Thank you. Stay in front of the
Julie.
too many things to keep track of.
I know.
Okay, We also have two grown sons who are in their 40s and excuse me, I have some guidance here in the audience. Two grown sons and one with two granddaughters for us. And they live far away, so we don't get to see them much, but we're very involved in our Mennonite church here in town. And there are a number of people in the audience tonight who are part of that Mennonite church or other Mennonite churches. So I will turn to them at certain points when I can answer your questions and they will help me out. So I'm going to go ahead with the PowerPoint and let's. Go ahead. No, there's no sound. No, should. Okay. So, for some of you, you may be expecting someone who looks a little different than me. Maybe you were coming to look for someone wearing a head covering or a dress and not cutting their hair. And I just want to point out that we kind of divide the Mennonite world into, on your left, old order Mennonites who look much like Amish do. In the middle, we have what are called conservative Mennonites, and we share many of the beliefs that I do, but I would be representative of the group on the right, and they're called officially in the world of people who study this mainline Mennonites. And I want to point out that we're a very small crew in the United States. We're only, I looked at it today, 62,000. There are probably more Catholics in Columbus than there are Mennonites, mainline Mennonites. If these were Amish, but they could be either old order Mennonite. I just got the picture off the web. Old order or Amish. There are 360,000 Amish in the US today. That's because they have large families and they tend to remain in the church. And I couldn't find a figure for conservative Mennonites, but the mainline Mennonites, like me, have lost a lot of members in the last 10 years since the LGBTQ issue has come up. So mainline Mennonites are very accepting, and even one of our two pastors is gay and is married. And so we live in different social worlds in many ways, but also share many Mennonite values. So Mennonites are part of what are called Anabaptists, and Anabaptists are re-baptizers. Technically, it means to baptize again. And it includes not only Mennonites, but Brethren. You've probably heard of Brethren. Amish are in that group, and Amish are an offshoot of Mennonites that happened way back in Europe. And they thought that the Mennonites were getting too wild. And so they said, no, we're going to keep our dress and we're not going to go with the modern ways. And then Hutterites, has anyone heard of Hutterites? Yeah. Or maybe some of you even have connections with these groups. And they're all considered peace churches. Although in my book, I also consider Quakers, but Quakers came out of a different strain. So when the Reformation happened, the Reformation in the 1500s in Europe of the Catholic Church, the main offshoot was of the Protestants and Martin Luther. And from that came the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and all of those groups. But there was a third path out of, here we have Catholics, here we have Protestants, and there was a tiny third path. And that was the Anabaptists. And they were different than Protestants, and they were actually persecuted by Protestants because they withheld infant baptism. So everybody else said it's okay to baptize infants, but Anabaptists thought that based on what they read in the New Testament, especially, it was supposed to be a believer's baptism, which meant you had to decide to be a Mennonite or an Anabaptist with an adult mind and their reasoning. You had to make a decision. And so when I became a Mennonite at age 36, although Mennonites baptize as early as I would say 14 in the church, so be considered an adult. I gave my confession of faith in front of the church and was baptized just with pouring of water, no submersion. So anyway, so this little path of Anabaptists off of the Reformation is called the Radical Reformation, not only because they withheld baptism until adulthood, but what that meant in the world of the 14, 15, 1600s is that you weren't registered with the state to be taxed and for military conscription, which was very important in those days. And so this was like too radical for both Catholics and for Protestants, and Mennonites, brethren, Amish became hunted, and they were actually jailed and sometimes killed because of their beliefs. That's why it's called the Radical Reformation. But we share many Christian beliefs that you all in this room share. And even if you come from another faith tradition than Christian, we believe in the Trinity of God, that God is both creator and God's Son, Jesus, and a Holy Spirit of sorts. God comes in three forms. That we believe in salvation, or I talk about it as healing that comes from God's grace in our lives, inviting that in. We believe in the humanity and divinity of Jesus, as most Christians do. The inspiration of Scripture, some believe in the literal interpretation of Scripture, but saying the inspiration of Scripture kind of covers all of us at the different types of understanding. And then the power of the Holy Spirit to work in our lives, to work in societies. And the church is the body of God on earth. We are the hands and the feet. So these are familiar to many of you, no matter what tradition you come from, even if you would come from Islam. Islam, of course, accepts the Bible, but it's a secondary book for them. And some read the Bible, and some know the Bible better than Christians do. But Mennonites are a little different in that we emphasize a couple of things that other groups may not. First of all, we put Jesus at the center, and we say we're supposed to look at his life, read what he said, take it seriously, act like it. And sometimes that's really hard. And I think that's one of the reasons I left First Community Church in Arlington growing up, because it didn't feel like people were taking some of the hard stuff really seriously. Secondly, community is really important. I'll talk more about that. And finally, the issue of peace, being a peace church. So what does this following Jesus, or making it the center of our vision for the world, what's it actually mean? Well, it means knowing how Jesus lived and what his teachings were, and his Sermon on the Mount and Beatitudes that you read in Matthew 5-7. So the whole series of blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the pure in heart, the oppressed, the peacemakers, and those persecuted for righteousness, for doing good, working for justice, in other words, and those who hunger for justice. So we take that pretty seriously in the Mennonite church. And one of the hardest teachings of Jesus, and he practiced it, was to love and care for not only our neighbors, but our enemies. And so we work at that pretty hard too. And following Jesus's teachings in life as the ultimate authority. So if there are contradictions with the Old Testament or even with the church, Jesus's teachings and his life trump everything. That's putting Jesus in the center. And when in conflict with others, the Bible talks about going and being reconciled. And so we take that very seriously too, and the work of conflict resolution. In fact, that's one excuse me, one of the courses that I teach at Ohio Dominican is interpersonal negotiation and mediation. And it's one of the things that drew me to the Mennonite church. They were providing leadership even back in the 80s in that area when my own church was not doing anything in that area. And then never returning evil for evil, but returning evil with good, even if it means dying for it. And that's what Jesus dying on the cross demonstrated, was a model for. So there's this famous story of martyrdom in the Mennonite church. This is a period in the 1500s when Mennonites and other Anabaptists were hunted by both Catholics and Protestants. And they were imprisoned, they were tortured, they were asked to recant of their beliefs. And then they could be drowned in the river. There were many awful things that were done. And we have a book called The Martyr's Mirror that has these photographs of some of the famous stories. So this is Dirk Willems. He's in the hat. And he was being chased by the sheriff or the law and order person in town who was after him because he was preaching and teaching as an Anabaptist. And he crossed a river to try to escape from the arms of the sheriff. He did run away, and the sheriff fell in a hole in the river and was screaming for help, was about to drown. And Dirk Willems turned back and saved his oppressor who was chasing him. And because of that, he was jailed. And I don't know the end of the story, if he died or not. He was executed. Thank you. We have Mennonites in the audience. So that's a pretty powerful witness to following your beliefs, to not returning evil for evil. So this emphasis on Jesus's teaching and putting him at the center leads Mennonites to emphasize living life fully here on earth. We don't concentrate, at least in the mainline Mennonite church, about going to heaven or eternal life. It's more about what we're doing here and how we're building God's kingdom. We baptize only adults by confession of faith to community, and we dedicate our children when they're born, when the parents want to, and the church commits to helping to raise this child in a loving way. But we don't baptize them because we believe it should be their choice. We celebrate communion, kind of like Catholics do, and Presbyterians do, and Methodists do, but only maybe once a month or once every 6 weeks. It's more a symbol of our commitment, our original baptism commitment. So some people who try out the Mennonite church miss having communion every Sunday. We also take seriously speaking truth to power. We do a lot with legislative advocacy, both in Columbus, in Washington, D.C., and at the United Nations. So we in Columbus, at Columbus Mennonite, work with bread. Do we have anybody here who's part of a church that's part of bread, which is, others who come to Columbus Mennonite? And it's a social justice oriented group of 45 congregations that includes Muslims and Jews and all kinds of Christians, many Catholics, many Presbyterians, Methodists, all kinds of Baptists in the group. And in Columbus, we work through bread as a coalition to put pressure on the mayor, the city safety director, the superintendent of schools to change policies to make Columbus less violent and more responsive. For example, we're working on affordable housing right now too. So we have a Washington office. We do advocacy in Washington, D.C., and then at the United Nations, we also have, I think it's called observer status, where we can advocate at the international level also. And I have a note there, of Matthew 21. This idea of speaking truth to power comes from Matthew 21, which is Jesus cleaning out the temple. Money lenders, the loan sharks, if you will. He had some righteous anger at what they were turning the temple yard into. And so we see Jesus as the model of really being assertive, speaking up when anger is warranted, not in a way that would harm others, but in a way that would get things changed. We try to love everybody, and we do healing services in our church, anointing with oil. We take teaching very seriously, Sunday school classes for adults and children. But taking it beyond the church too, with food and shelter and spiritual support. And there are a couple of concrete examples of that. Mennonite Central Committee. My husband and I served for 2 years in Guatemala with Mennonite Central Committee. It's the service arm of the Mennonite Church. So there would be an equivalent for those of you who are Lutheran, probably those of you who are Muslim. And then Global Gallery here in town, which sells fair trade gifts. Global Galleries was started back in the 80s by a Mennonite who had served abroad with Mennonite Central Committee. And she was in Puerto Rico serving with her husband. And the poor that they were working with were learning needlepoint, and they were making some really cool things. And yet there was no market for them to sell among the poor. And so she bought and then brought back to the United States a number of these products, sold them, and then returned the money to those who made it. And this started a chain of working with about 50 countries today around the world with fair trade products. And so how many of you have been to a Global Galleries in Short North? So you know this stuff, and you can get fair trade at so many places these days. Heck, I get my coffee now and it's fair trade. So I think most supermarkets have even caught on. Most Mennonites are conscientious objectors to war and do not use weapons to protect themselves or their family. Now, there are probably some Mennonites who do own weapons, but they probably would not use them to kill someone else. They might try to use them in self-defense, but most wouldn't even own a gun. And they would say, I would rather die than have to kill someone else. So there's real opposition to killing. They oppose violence because of Jesus's modeling in war and capital punishment. Now, abortion is a controversial issue in the mainline Mennonite Church. So you're not going to find everybody opposing abortion, but pretty much for the other groups, they would oppose abortion on the same grounds that they would oppose violence and war and capital punishment. But also in poverty, sexism, racism, we really work hard on racism and ageism, etc. So in our church, but this would not be true of the conservative Mennonites, or they would not be advocating for LGBT groups, but in the mainline Mennonite church, we would. And then we also have another distinctive. You won't find a flag in the front of most Mennonite churches because we believe that our first allegiance is to God. And by having the flag that's saying my first allegiance is to the United States of America. There is an allegiance that we would hold to the United States of America, but it's after God. And so community, I said, was the second kind of distinctive of Mennonites. It's the center of our lives. So while I do have friends outside the Mennonite church, most of them are in the Mennonite church. So we get to know each other pretty well. It's like an extended family. So most congregations are smaller. There are exceptions to that, though. And we tend to know everybody in the church by name, a little bit about them, their kids, their grandkids. And we tend to get together for meals and do things together. So we really work hard at community. And we meet at least weekly for our worship services. We do worship on Sunday, but we also always have adult Sunday school classes going on. So most adults continue to study the Bible or do other book studies throughout their life. Right now, we've been doing a lot on anti-racism work in our adult Sunday school classes, but also on reparations to Indigenous Native Americans and also to African Americans and studying that. Adult baptism, which, we see the church as the body of Christ, the hands and feet in the world. and are very aware that some people see communion or the elements as the body of Christ that they're actually ingesting. So there's a difference there. Adult baptism is sharing of our faith statement, and it's usually 14, 15 or older. And the reason for this community emphasis, I think, began in Europe in the 1500s when Mennonites were a hunted minority, and they were considered a threat to the state and to the church. And so sometimes husbands were jailed, or husbands or even wives were killed. And so the small group of Mennonites or brethren or Hutterites, whatever they were, gathered around the family and helped to care for them. So that's, I think, part of the origin of community being so important. Mennonites do expect a degree of holy living. I know when I joined the Mennonite church back in 1990, the church that we joined, which was a mainline Mennonite church in South Bend, Indiana, you really didn't, if you liked a little wine in the evening with your dinner, you did not have it when you had Mennonite guests over for dinner. Now, today it's different. So Mennonites enjoy beer and wine, and I think other things, but mostly they don't smoke. And there's some expectation of living relatively simply below your means. And I do need to mention that for the more conservative groups, especially the Old Order Mennonites, they still use shunning. And that is rejecting a member who they believe is sinning. And for them, sinning would be getting a divorce or getting a divorce and then remarrying would really be not okay. Joining the military would not be okay. And so we do not do that, but we would tend to, if we had a major conflict with somebody in church, we would go and talk with them and we would try to work it out. So there are three major community preserving practices because this is so important. Forgiveness and reconciliation, taking that really seriously rather than leaving a church for a reason of having difficulty with someone, really trying to reconcile before you leave. Reliance on community I can't even read that far away, to discern direction. So when my husband and I decided we were interested in doing work with Mennonite Central Committee in Guatemala, and also before I became active with the Reserve Corps in the summers with Christian peacemaker teams, I discerned with my small group from church, a group of 10 or 12 people, usually adults. Is this God's calling? Is this my ego? What's going on here? And I found that process of discernment really, really helpful over the years. And then finally, providing mutual aid. So there was an organization called Mennonite Mutual Aid, and we would provide help for Mennonites for sure in need, financial need for pretty much any reason. And this has, Mennonite Mutual Aid has become a financial investment firm that also provides mutual aid. It's now called Everance. And I don't know, how many of you have seen the recent film that just came out, Women Talking? Yeah, it's powerful. It's powerful, but some would say boring because you see a lot of women talking and they're Old Order Mennonites. And I believe it's Bolivia. Does it identify in film? Bolivia.
Yeah. The film didn't identify it, but I think that's
yeah. And they don't even identify that they're Mennonites, but they are Mennonites. And what has happened in this film is that some of the men in the community, a very tight Old Order community, had decided to use an animal tranquilizer that would be used today by veterinarians, maybe, who are going to anesthetize somebody for surgery, an animal for surgery, but they sneak into people's homes at night, anesthetize women and rape them. And finally,
And girls.
Girls, right, and girls, thank you. And finally, the women begin talking, getting together, and finally decide they have to do something about it. And they talk about, should they leave? Should they confront their oppressors? They're not quite sure everybody who's an oppressor is yet, or should we just go on and be pacifists and do nothing but try to protect each other? And so you get to see them in process of working it out. And they do decide to leave. Sorry, I'm spoiling it for you, but it's still a very powerful film, I think, of people who take their faith seriously and forgiveness seriously and attempting to reconcile, but sometimes you still have to leave a bad situation. So I recommend it. Community needs Mennonites to do a number of concrete things in the world. We reach out globally with the good news that God is love and wants everybody to benefit from that love, to service for those in need. There is a mission network that is more about church planting, Mennonite Mission Network. There's Mennonite Central Committee that does more of the service work. And right now, Mennonite Central Committee's niche is more peace and justice education, and we're providing mediation, training in mediation to churches around the world. And then Mennonite Disaster Service. Many people know Mennonites, and this is old order get together with conservative Mennonites and mainline Mennonites to go to areas where there's been a hurricane or a drought or a flood, and they build the houses. They're the ones. Other groups, the Lutherans go and they provide food, and the Methodists go and they provide clothing, but the Mennonites go and they construct houses. So we do have a lot of handy men and women in the Mennonite church. It's really nice, who have real kinds of building skills. And then before there was Airbnb and before there were beds and breakfasts, we had Mennonite Your Way. Has anybody heard of Mennonite Your Way? Okay, so this was a little booklet, and you could apply to be a host family in Mennonite Your Way, and they were all over the US and Canada. And you could call up someone and say, we'd like to come in on April 15th. Can you put us up for the night? We're a family of 4. And they would say, sure. And there might be a donation given, or there might be a firm price per person, but they'd give you a place to sleep. And there are other Mennonites, and then usually breakfast and send you on your way. It was fun. And we met, as we were a host family, and when we lived in Kansas, we met the most interesting people being hosts in Mennonite Your Way. So this is all part of community. We hold both kids, and I've already said this, in adult Sunday school for lifetime study and discernment. We promote small groups, as many churches do these days. So really encourage new members to become a part. And there are small groups we have an acoustic music group. We have a big group of women who make comforters that go to refugees abroad. We have women's coffee groups, men's breakfast groups. We have young families groups that get together and watch their kids play and get a little grown-up time. So all kinds of small groups. We do start Mennonite schools and universities. Some of you know Bluffton College. I think we have a Bluffton graduate here. Yeah. And that's in Bluffton, Ohio. Goshen College is in Goshen, Indiana. And Bethel College is in Newton, Kansas. That's where I used to teach before I came here. Eastern Mennonite University. And there are also Canadian universities. They usually do have graduate programs. And the distinctive of the Mennonite schools, because they're open to anyone, anybody. You don't have to even be a Christian to come. The distinctive would be you take a theology or a Bible and religion course, and you usually take some peace studies courses too. So it's just part of the general requirements. We do provide mutual aid to all members in need, and we tend to invest financially. Mennonites are really frugal, and they will invest savings in socially responsible investing. And what does that mean? For Mennonites, that means not defense industry contractors, no petroleum, no alcohol, and nobody who makes guns. Those would be the non-socially responsible groups. We manage our churches, at least the mainline Mennonite church, fairly democratically. So most decisions are made by the entire group. We do have a leadership team and we have lots of committees, but unlike, say, in a Catholic church where there might be a priest that makes a lot of the decisions, or even we used to belong to a Presbyterian church, the lead pastor made all the decisions. Basically, we were not consulting. So I really like the democratic nature of the mainline Mennonite church. We also sing together a lot. And I think this came about because early Mennonites refused to have instruments in the churches. No pianos, no organs, no brass, no violins. And they learned to make beautiful music together. So in most Mennonite churches, you find the congregation is like the choir, and it's 4-part harmony, and it's gorgeous. My husband is a professional musician and music major, and that's what attracted him to the Mennonite church, this singing. So if you ever want to hear that on Sunday morning, we worship at 9:30 on Sunday. Come on over in Clintonville. Mennonites tend to live simply below their means to give generously to the church and other peace and justice organizations globally. And there's kind of a one-upmanship, like regarding, well, where did you get that cool sweater you have on? Oh, well, I got it at the thrift store on Indianola. Or so we really try to live simply, and we're big thrifters or make our own clothing. And we try to practice servant leadership, which makes the best leaders serve. And in our work in peace and reconciliation being the central part of our work, we believe that Jesus came to show us how to live, not just to save us for eternal life. And that we're supposed to live together as God's family on earth through God's Spirit empowering us, not through our own egos, not through our own will, but through God's Spirit empowering us. And so we talk about the peaceable kingdom here on earth of love and justice. And so we're working on creating that here on earth. We believe reconciliation and forgiveness are making broken relationships right again. And we can't always do it. And it's really sad when we can't. But we will at least work hard at getting there. Dan, did you want to make a comment? It looked like you were raising your hand.
No.
Okay.
I'll
All right.
something later on.
All right. So, but we also believe that peace and reconciliation address societal issues. So at least in the mainline Mennonite church, we have wide concerns about poverty, about oppressed groups. We're working on anti-racism efforts, anti-sexism. Women were allowed to preach in the mainline Mennonite church in the 1970s, the very first. There's still resistance, even in some mainline Mennonite churches, I am sad to say. So we work on a lot of new isms, and we believe violence leads to more violence. And thus, we use nonviolence, and we teach skills of conflict resolution. And we try to provide healing and hope for all, so that they're not in horrible situations where they feel that they have to rise up and start a civil war or a revolution. So more concrete ways that we do this work of peace and reconciliation through preparing our young men and women for conscientious objection to war. And so many Mennonites, but not all, would claim to be pacifists. So I claim to be a Christian pacifist, but I've never really been tested. It's easy to say, and it's another thing to do. And those who do choose to serve in the military would usually serve as non-combatants. They would be medics, or they would have a desk or supply job. And one of the ways that Mennonites responded when we did have a draft in the United States, World War II, Korean War, just after the Korean War, Mennonites formed POX. And POX in the 1950s was the forerunner, or was the model for the Peace Corps. It actually says in the literature, this was the idea of sending young men who had conscientious objector status to serving in Korea, they could go to an area of need, usually in healthcare, sometimes in education, sometimes in building houses around the world, and serve in that way, same number of years and that kind of thing. We do work actively for peace and justice, both locally and around the world. And there's another agency called Mennonite Conciliation Service. It provides mediation services to anyone who wants them, with trained mediators, and then Mennonite Central Committee that I already talked about. We have taken the lead in restorative justice work in the courts. Has anybody heard of VORP? VORP? Victim Offender Reconciliation Programs. So these work with willing victims of crime and willing offenders of crime to talk about the crime and the harm and give the offender an opportunity to make things right, to share why they vandalized that person's house, or sometimes worse. But it's always when parties are willing, and we find when restorative justice is used in the court system, again, voluntarily, never mandatory, that most offenders do not reoffend. They have such a powerful experience of seeing the harm that they've done and working to remedy that harm, that they don't offend again. So this restorative justice work has even impacted our Columbus public schools. We now have restorative circles. Is anybody aware of that? In 4 of our Columbus public schools, and they're supposed to spread this to 20% of all schools, just in Columbus public, by 2026, I believe it is. And we were the church that was part of the group that was advocating for issues related to juvenile crime, juvenile violence, juvenile justice, and introduce the idea of restorative justice. We promote work of community or Christian peacemaker teams. Has anybody heard of Christian peacemaker teams? Okay, so this is a group that I worked with for almost 20 summers as a Reserve Corps member in Palestine and in Colombia. And we go to areas of acute conflict. There are groups currently still in Palestine or in the West Bank, and in Iraq, the Kurdish area of Iraq, in Colombia, and in working with indigenous groups in Canada. So these are areas where people's land is being threatened, or where human rights workers or pastors or even educators' lives are being threatened because of the work they're doing. Christian peacemaker teams will accompany them without being a bodyguard. They are unarmed bodyguards. And so as a peace and justice studies professor at Ohio Dominican, I really felt like I needed to take a lead in that area. That was probably my initial motivation to getting involved. But I grew so much and learned so much and was able to bring lots of rich examples back to the classroom of alternatives to violence. Because if you're going to stand up and say, no, I'm a pacifist in time of war, and it's World War II going on, and you have Adolf Hitler, you need to have some alternatives. Otherwise, it just looks like you're a yellow belly running. And so I think Mennonites work really hard at alternatives to violence. We do have a reconciliation covenant in our church, and this is a commitment to really work on conflict and to expect the best of intentions from others. We also have a mediation team that I serve on, and we all have been to at least week-long mediation trainings. I've been to much more than that. And sometimes the team actually works outside of our church. We do very much care for the earth. Creation care is a part of who we are as Columbus Mennonite, and many of the mainline Mennonite churches have environmental sustainability networks. We in the mainline Mennonite church are supportive of LGBT people. It's not about hate the sin, love the sinner. No, they're not seen as sinners in the mainline Mennonite church. if you are an LGBTQ person. We also have been very responsive to undocumented immigrants and other minorities in various ways. Some of you may know that for about 3.5 years, we provided sanctuary for Edith Espinal, an undocumented Mexican citizen who was being deported under the Trump administration. And we knew that Homeland Security usually did not enter places of worship to take people to a detention center, and agreed with her and her family that we would house her. So we had to put in a full bathroom upstairs, and we gave her one of the classrooms. And she's an amazing woman because she lived in our church for 3.5 years. And we continue to provide sanctuary for someone who's there today. We promote reparations with African Americans and Indigenous groups in the United States. And our church has made an annual commitment to pay $20,000 is basically what we try to pay each year. We were paying to 2 groups in the Central Ohio area. One is a Native American group, and the other is an African American group. Where did we get the $20,000 idea? Well, it came from, if we were in the building that we're in and we're taxed, because we're nonprofit and so we're not taxed, but if we had to pay taxes every year, it would be about $20,000 property tax. So that's what, it's a huge part of our budget, but we are doing it because we feel really badly about what we've done to Native Americans and African Americans. So why did I become a Mennonite? Well, I was 36. I was going back to grad school to study peace and justice, get my Ph.D. in sociology. I was visiting a Mennonite church because my husband and I said, okay, we're going to join a peace church this time. We're in a new city. And after the service, this is really common, there's a sharing time because churches are small. And one person got up and they just shared that they had some medical problems and they were asking for prayer for healing. Another person got up and he said, I'm on the national board for Habitat for Humanity. Does anybody know Habitat? Builds houses for those in need. He was on the national board. He said, we have our big board meeting this weekend, and I asked for prayers because we're going to be making some really big issues. Well, we had been contributing to Habitat for years, and I really believed in the organization. I thought, whoa, these people, this guy's on the board. They're taking this seriously. And then a third person got up and they said, I'm looking for help this weekend. I'm putting a new roof on my neighbor's house. He was just doing it for free. It was an older woman. She didn't have money to pay for it. Can anybody help me? Raise your hands now and we'll get together after church. And I thought, oh, here's where the rubber meets the road. These people are taking their faith really seriously. And that was just the first Sunday. And we joined after that. For my husband, it was music mainly. But for me, it was trying to carry this stuff out in life. We loved the peace and justice as mission work rather than saving souls, and the strong practice of community. That's been a real blessing. So I'm ready to wrap up here. Just want to differentiate between mainline Mennonites, which I've been talking about, that's me, and old order Mennonites and conservative Mennonites would tend to follow more of these things. And maybe some of you would hope to talk to somebody who believed that you needed to dress conservatively and uniformly, women in dresses, attending school only through the 8th grade, although conservative Mennonites sometimes go on to a little bit of college, have very large families, live in rural areas and farm, use shunning and rejection to punish sin. They, generally speaking, do not vote or serve in the military. They fear the influence of higher education often. They practice very traditional male and female roles, with males being head of household. They interpret the Bible literally. And while I say I take the Bible seriously, I do not take it literally. And so there's a big difference there. They reject LGBTQ persons as this is serious sin. They accept corporal punishment of their kids, and in their schools, they support strict separation of church and state. They reject abortion, war, and capital punishment, and they do. The conservative Mennonites use cars and electricity. The old order sometimes do also. It's the Amish who don't use electricity and cars. And the cool thing is that all three of these Mennonite groups participate together in Mennonite Central Committee. We all contribute financially, and many serve who are in these more conservative groups. In Mennonite Disaster Service, the first ones on site for building a new house are often the Amish, and the Mennonite Mission Network also. So that's a really cool piece of working together. And they choose non-college trained pastors and often choose them by lot. You draw the short straw, and you're one of three, and you're going to be the pastor for the next year. And they have more in common. The more old order Mennonites have much more in common with the Amish than they would with me. In fact, they would really question me as a Christian, I'm afraid. So I'm going to end there, and I'm really going to hope there are some questions, but I've probably run over in time. It's 8 o'clock. So you tell me, Ann, what you want to do.
Oh, yeah, let's do questions. I'm looking up at chat up there, and I believe it usually says a number if there are some questions there, but Julie, could you just click on chat up there at the top? And we'll see if there's any questions that were submitted by.
Something quick.
It's kind of in the middle,
Above the green.
Yeah.
right there. I'm not seeing any. So we'll certainly take any questions that might come from the audience here.
Yes.
My mother was raised Amish, and her family left and joined the Mennonite church in Holmes County. And I never really truly understood. I didn't know that they were shunned when they left the Amish church. And I wondered if it was because the Mennonite was not quite the movement away from the world. She often talked about washing your feet. Do they do that in the Mennonite church now?
We do, even in the mainline Mennonite church, but not as often but if we do, it would be usually during the night. But I know they do in the old order Mennonite church and in conservative Mennonite. I was first exposed in the conservative Mennonite church. The question for those of you on Zoom is washing of feet. So that's something Jesus did. We take Jesus seriously, and so it is practiced. But this gentleman, in case you couldn't hear, his parents left the Amish church.
My mother.
Oh, okay.
Immigrant.
And joined the Mennonite church in Holmes County. And there are lots of Mennonites and Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. Yeah. We are a Mennonite Mecca here in Ohio.
Looks like there is a question under chat now, Jules.
Familiar with the well-established.
I lived then for 2 years in Guatemala right next to Belize, but I never made it to Belize. But I know some folks whose kids actually work here with Mennonite Central Committee. So I know that they've been very successful in Belize. And I think that they're dairy farmers. That's what I remember hearing. Are there any other questions from our Zoom audience? Or here, Dan?
Well, from your experience, I grew up in Mennonite, and we've been called mainstream Mennonite. And I wish they were all like what you described, and I don't think they are. But would you say the Mennonites, have you been exposed to the Mennonites were evangelical? I would think if you went out into the rural areas and you saw a Mennonite church, it might not be what you're describing.
Yeah, but those would probably be conservative Mennonites. So, no? Okay, so.
They might have left it over some issue, and usually over evangelism versus peace work.
Okay. Yeah.
Have you had much experience with people coming out of the evangelical background?
No, I do have experience with conservative Mennonites. That was our first introduction to Mennonites. Did you want to comment, Linda?
Oh, I have a question.
Okay.
While the mainline Mennonites don't want to do shunning and rejection and all that, is there any kind of discipline at all for Mennonites that don't live up to some of these principles? I mean, no one's perfect, but not even make an effort to do these things.
Yeah, I am aware at Columbus Mennonite Church that there was a member, longstanding member, at one time who she became more evangelical. And she would use sharing time at the end of the service to come up and talk for lengthy periods in front of the church. And she was asked by the pastor to keep it to a minute or two. And when she didn't do that, I do remember one time a pastor coming up and escorting her away. And I do believe she stopped coming after some time. So that's the kind of discipline I've seen. I think that if there were well-founded evidence of problems, that the pastor or somebody on our shepherding team would be talking to someone, but there would always be options. There wouldn't be anything like, hey, you can't be a member anymore.
Just having grown up and still have a lot, I still consider myself not even though I go to church. My mother was and all that. It all depends on the church. The church and in the mainline church, I think, well, the power comes from the denomination, from the local church and not the hierarchy. And so, I know the church I grew up, they excommunicated a guy. I asked my dad, why so and so lives across the street, he's got a Mennonite name, why did he leave? Why is he not here? Oh, he got kicked out. Why? Well, he joined the Eagles, a fraternal group. That was a long time ago. But I know people that got kicked out for not living a fraternal.
Fraternal organization, yeah.
Losing,
Yeah,
things like the
okay.
mooses and
Another question. Okay, reading this next question, do the Mennonites interact with the Jewish and non-Jewish communities in Israel as well as Palestinians in the West Bank in order to promote a peaceful resolution to conflict? When I worked there for 4 summers, yes, we were working alongside Rabbis for Human Rights and a number of other Jewish organizations that were on the progressive end of the political spectrum and who were very concerned about Palestinian rights. But for the most part, I will tell you that our work was standing with Palestinians who were losing their land or homes to the Israeli military that were in the West Bank. That answers it. And then another question coming in. Shunning seems to be a conflict with reconciliation and forgiveness. I agree that shunning seems to be a problem with that. And that's another reason I'm part of the mainline Mennonite church. Now, I think if it sounds like shunning is what happened with the woman who continued to abuse her privilege to speak in church, that it wasn't shunning in my eyes. She could always have attended, but she probably would have been given boundaries for what appropriate sharing was in the future. She chose to leave.
Does your church participate in the bread group?
Yes, we're
Okay.
very active in.
Well, the church I attended was very active, and I thought there was
Yeah.
the bread group, a church from, are there other Mennonite churches in
No,
Columbus?
not in the local bread group.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
One of the students that, when I was serving as superintendent of Grandview, the pastor of a Mennonite church in Virginia came to this church. In fact, his daughter attended school with my daughter and played soccer with her.
Mhm.
the nicest family you ever wanted to meet. But I, when you talk about social justice, I thought they have to be a member of the bread group.
Yeah, very active. Yes, Joe.
Julie, I wonder if you can expand on something, and as you shared with us, you have participated in the mission work of the Mennonite Church, and it's my understanding that while the Mennonite missionaries are very active and very helpful in improving the conditions of communities that they are called to serve abroad and elsewhere, that they don't necessarily try to convert the people, the communities to the Mennonite faith. Can you expand a little bit on
So
that?
you're speaking specifically of those who with Mennonite Mission Network, probably, but not Mennonite Central Committee?
I wouldn't have the slightest idea.
I think what you're probably, because certainly when I worked with Mennonite Central Committee, I was doing peace and justice education. I wasn't converting anybody except to ideas for peacemaking, real concrete skills for peacemaking. My experience with the Mennonite Mission Network workers in Guatemala, we worked alongside them. We did in-services alongside them. There were 2 nurses who were doing way out in the mountains with the indigenous Mayan population. They were providing health care for them and just doing it in the name of Christ and not trying to convert anyone. Yeah, so if that's indicative of other Mennonite Mission Network, then I think the answer is no, there's not a lot of evangelism in the traditional sense. Yes, another question. What is the origin of the term Mennonite? Oh, Mennonite comes from a man by the name of Menno Simons, who was an early follower of the Anabaptists, and he began writing down a lot of his beliefs, and he did a lot of preaching and traveled and spoke. And so people who really liked what he was doing began to call themselves Mennonites. So the origin is way back in Europe in the 1500s. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Julie, do you want to talk about your work in Guatemala with Ohio Dominican students, your course?
Sure. So for, I think, five different May terms, I took about 10 students to Guatemala for 2 weeks to study poverty and development. And I worked within the network of there's a Mennonite seminary in Guatemala. My husband and I worked when we lived there. And they also have a language study school, and they work with college groups from around the world, actually. So I worked with them to say, okay, we're going to study the causes of poverty at the grassroots level in the first week. And I want a speaker to speak on economic issues, on cultural issues, etc. And they line all that up for you. It's really nice. And we had housing there at the seminary and meals there, and they provide transportation and translation if the speaker does not speak English. The second week, we go into the mountains and with an indigenous group of Mayans called Kekchi, and they speak Kekchi as their first language and Spanish as their second language. And we actually have a student of that course here in the audience. Raise your hand, Shakita. So Shakita is Ohio Dominican graduate, and she went on the course with me actually 2 different times. And so we pair them up, and they stay in a very poor family's home for 24 hours. And for some, it's the hardest thing they have ever done in their life, because this is dirt floors. Do you want to say a little bit about it?
The longest 24 hours of your life is what it was. Yeah, most of the time I spent interacting with the children because as Julie said, that the Kekchi is their first language, and the parents are usually only speaking that, and then the kids are all learning Spanish in their schools. And so conversations were intellectually at a very low level, which was perfect for me with my Spanish. And yeah, just a very humbling experience to get to know how a different type of people live, and not in a feel bad for them way. If anything, I actually felt bad for us because they live in such tight-knit communities with their families, their aunts and uncles are there, their grandparents are there. And we seem like such an isolated society after I had been in the mountains. I don't wish to live in the mountains on a dirt floor house, but the positive aspects of living in such tight-knit community, yeah, I definitely wish we had more of that here.
Thank you. Yeah, it is hard for all of them. No electricity, an outhouse, no running water, but bathe in a bucket. And it's life-changing for many of them. They decide on a new or slightly different career path, where it just puts our lush lifestyle in the United States in a really new concrete perspective for how much we have. Yes.
The Amish church has a thing called Rumspringa. Does the Mennonite have anything like that where you have to make a decision whether you're going to join the church or become part of the world?
No, other than baptism, adult baptism. And if you decide not to get baptized and just want to keep coming to church, that's fine too. So it's pretty loose.
Julie, do you know what your numbers are as far as retention of youth? Or do they go off and become spiritual but not religious?
I think a lot of them, Linda has written a book on spiritual, not religious, as a theologian from MTSO. And I know that's what happened to our sons. They've become spiritual and not religious, even though we raised them in the Mennonite church. And so far, tracking, I've been a part of this Mennonite church for almost 20 years. It looks like a lot of our youth are choosing not to be a part of the church, but it is clear, I think, for all families, Catholic, Presbyterian, etc. Once you have children, once you pair and you have children, there's a draw that wasn't there before to join the church. And so I think that that's true somewhat for Mennonites also. Do you know more about that issue?
Well, I have seen numbers that to a degree, the evangelicals, definitely the Mormons and somewhat Mennonites do a better job of retaining youth. But when I saw those numbers, it didn't say what kind of Mennonite.
Right.
So maybe it's the conservative Mennonites that retain their youth better.
When I was reading today, the Amish are retaining their youth by 80%, which seemed low to me for Amish, but yes.
And then there's a problem also with there's so few Mennonite churches. If you look around, there are certain enclaves, Goshen, Elkhart, Newton,
Right.
Bluffton, Holmes County, but you know, where do the kids go when they leave the area and there's no church around? Some of them become Presbyterians.
Right.
Some become
Forbid.
How many people are in your church?
We have about 200.
What percent of those people would have grown up Mennonite?
You know, I don't
Just a
think
guess.
the guess is 50%. Yeah, so we have a lot of new folks like me. Yeah. Question. Nice interact with the United States Institute of Peace. The Washington office is very aware of the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I think they do work together on advocacy for certain legislation. And my guess would be that that would be a spot where Mennonites, especially who have a graduate degree in political science or peace and justice, would want to work. But I don't know of any Mennonites there right now. Yes.
Can you elaborate about what you mean by your children have become spiritual? I'm just curious.
The question is about what does it mean when your kids become spiritual but not religious? Do you want to give a more detailed answer, Linda?
Sure, no problem, but how long do I have?
No.
Not long.
You have 2 minutes
Yeah.
because she studies this stuff.
Linda was a speaker for sharing our stories about a year and a half ago.
Oh, okay, okay.
And Joe was a speaker about, in fact, 2 years ago this month on his immigration from
Well,
Cuba.
in a nutshell, when people say they're spiritual but not religious, what they object to is the institutionalization of religion. They see religion as an external, even legal, dogmatic kind of thing that's not essential and not even interesting. And they see spirituality as kind of a heartfelt, independent thing that doesn't require membership or commitment or, signing on to different doctrines. And so a lot of when kids, even were raised in the church, like your children, like my son, when they leave, they want to still say they're a good person and they have morals and all that. So they often adopt the term spiritual but not religious. Now, there's others that actually seem to be more like seekers and are looking for an alternative spirituality, and they may be practicing yoga or Tai Chi or do meditation and all. But the track record statistically is that practicing Lone Ranger, what I call Lone Ranger spirituality, dwindles down like you're driving your car without gas, and eventually you're driving it on fumes. So right now, the prospects of SBNR, spiritual but not religious, being a new movement that gathers together and becomes like a religion doesn't look good.
Oh, okay.
I'm hoping you all heard that in Zoom land because that was really good on spiritual, not religious.
Spoke as loud as I could without being crazy.
Okay, yes.
Oh, I just wanted to comment as somebody who also goes to Columbus Mennonite Church. I do spend a lot of time with the young adults, and it's interesting because a lot of them are ethnic Mennonites and they're my age. And we have talked about this actually at length about how they would consider themselves to be more spiritual, not so much religious, because of what you said about the institution of it all.
Yeah.
And yeah, I actually often describe myself. I say I'm there for the community, not the sermons, because the sermons are important, but it's really the community. So that's interesting. I want to talk more about this going downhill. Yeah.
But can I make a comment there? The fact is that the Mennonites actually have a lot of young people are more committed to issues than institutions. But the kind of issues that Mennonites bring up and care about are really the same issues, I think, that a lot of young people believe in. But nevertheless, you don't find this huge rush of young people to join. So you have to look at that closely and carefully. That's why you have community, a lot of people are lonely, you got that, you got peace, yes, they want that, you have all the right issues, anti-racism, and still you're not like flooded with young people. Why is that?
Sunday morning, everyone wants to get up.
It's not just
No, I have a friend though, who just like.
I've heard comments from new members of the church that they were drawn to the church because of the work we were doing with Sanctuary, with Edith Espinal, and that we are one of the first Mennonite churches with a gay pastor.
Yeah.
That's taking a difficult stand. And then being aware of the peace and justice work that we do, I think that is attractive to a number of young people that would be turned off. My sons, for example, say that they're totally turned off. They were born in the 80s and were coming of age in the 90s when there were mega churches and mega church pastors that were having affairs and spending money in lavish lifestyles and judging other people so harshly. And they clearly were able to say to me, Mom, I just don't want to be associated with anything like that because that's so ugly to me. And so neither of them are involved in church, and I ache for them because neither of them have community of any. I mean, they just have a couple of couple friends. And community is pretty wonderful when you've got it. Yeah.
And yet we did not invent hypocrisy. It's been part of the human condition since the beginning.
Yeah.
I think that's so interesting that you said that your sons did not want to have anything to do with the hypocrisy of the mega churches, when I'm seeing the things that you're sharing about the Mennonite church, and there's hardly any hypocrisy there, and they're so frugal and so careful with the means and sharing with everybody. And I'm sure that you have personalities that clash, of course, but still You know, it's sad to me that they would compare what you're doing and the influence that you were making to something like that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's interesting she mentioned about the Mormons, because we are both of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we do have kids that are choosing not to stay. And it is really hard, you know, or, you know, we are a mission-minded church too. And I have 3 grandchildren who are on missions right now for 2 years. And they, you know, they save their money, and their parents and they are paying for that 2 years of living away. And it's a big, you know, not just that, but it's a big commitment, because, you know, they're taking away from theirs, going to college and for that amount of time and everything. But they're having an opportunity as a young person when their mind is just being able to develop to their full decisions, to do something so service oriented and spiritual outside of themselves. And kids don't get that today. Whereas when my parents were young, everybody was in the military, and the men, and then all the women and families were serving the country in some way, you know, whether it was you know, World War II, where there was a Mennonite who was serving in an office or in a, you know, a way of medical, you know, or something. But we do have that, and I think that that's something that's different than others, because they are developing Christ-like love and service. And a lot of kids are just, it's all me, and they're not getting that very important part of helping other people, which you are doing. So important.
I hope you all heard that. That was a Church of the Latter-day Saints speaking about what many youth after high school do in the Mormon church is serve 2 years abroad. They raise money for it, and they're proselytizing, yes, but it is a way of getting them out of their comfort zone and getting them out of themselves. And it's really powerful, and probably part of the reason that you have fairly good retention then into adulthood.
Well, their greatest convert is their own selves. And it does more for them than anybody else. So it's been a wonderful experience. And Sharon and I, we have our children, now I have grandchildren, so this is really something, but very interesting too.
Hey, well, should we call them a night?
Yeah, let me just, thank you all for coming tonight. It was a very enjoyable discussion, and of course, a wonderful presentation by a superb teacher. Yes, and I appreciate it very much. I do want to mention April 25th, here in the library on Zoom and YouTube, Sam Shim talking about emigrating as a child from South Korea and his life story. It'll be a very interesting story, and I invite you all to join us. So good night and thank you.
Oh, yeah, I know.
We're from here. Okay, do you want to know more about?
Yeah. Maybe they are, and I'll tell me.
Not so much a personal story, but exploring about. Yes. In fact, there's gonna be a really.
Yeah, I know what that.
Yeah.
Deacon. Oh, great, it's great. And I'm looking.
I bought. And his brother was like, you know, because it's such a big job.
Yeah.
But basically.
There was so much. I didn't know. Yeah, I thought.
Why, but we're the.